Good morning and welcome to the sixth webinar in the Intralogistics Live series, brought to you by Linde Material Handling. Today's session is entitled Appetite for Change, Building More Resilient Food and Drink Supply Chains. From geopolitical instability to rising costs, global supply chains are being tested like never before. And with billions of mouths to feed, the consequences of disruption to food and drink systems could not be higher. My name is Dave Harris, and over the next 60 minutes, our expert panel will be exploring the pressure points impacting global food and drink supply chains and the strategies that can, should, and are being deployed to insulate against them. So, to help us unpack these challenges and opportunities, let me first introduce our panel of experts and senior leaders from across the supply chain, intralogistics, and the food and drink sector. James Rothwell is Head of Supply Chain Insight at the Institute of Grocery Distribution, where he leads IGD's supply chain service, focusing on innovation, sustainability and operational excellence. Rod Addy is the Director General of the Provision Trade Federation and a 20-year veteran of the trade press who helped launch The Grocer Online and is a former editor of Food Manufacture. Robert Gittins is the UK Managing Director for Palletways, Europe's largest express palletised freight network, who brings more than 4 decades of experience in the logistics sector. Bobby Campbell is the National Business Development Manager for Linde Material Handling UK, specialising in the food sector. And Amanda Johnston is the Director of Innovation at Sheffield Hallam University's Advanced Food Innovation Centre, who has previously spent 8 years in blue-chip food manufacturing and held management roles at Northern Foods and Cadbury Trebor Bassett. Before we begin, a quick reminder that attendees are encouraged to submit questions throughout the session using the Q&A function. We'll endeavour to address as many as possible during the discussion and at the end of the session, time permitting. So, to kick us off, I'd like to ask each panellist to share their view on how exposed food and drink supply chains really are today, and whether the sector is in a more vulnerable position than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Bobby, from your point of view at Linde Material Handling, you meet a lot of people in the industry. What's your view on this?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I think we've been seeing quite a lot of ongoing disruption from global events, labour shortages, and then constant shift in demand, which has increased pressures on every part of the chain. I think, like everybody else has already says, one of the biggest factors right now is the rise in energy costs, which impacts everything from production, cold storage, transport, warehousing. And in a temperature sensitive sector like food, these costs are really hitting harder than probably ever. So I would say that exposure is probably, the right word right now in that industry.
Okay, thank you. And Amanda, sorry to make you wait right to the end here, but let's have your view. Obviously from you're in academia as well now, but clearly you were in the industry very much so. So how are you seeing it?
So yeah, and we're in academia, but we work a lot with businesses. So our research is applied and collaborative with the sector. So we're very much involved in some of these changes, which drives the research and innovation that we undertake. So as everybody else has said, climate change. Growing populations are a major impact on demands in the food system, and then political and market challenges. I mean, we've had examples given already, but also things like tariff uncertainty has sort of crept in over in recent months. And in terms of whether we're more vulnerable than we were 5 or 10 years ago, if we look at our reliance on imports, for example, they grew 5% last year. 40% of what we consume in the UK is imported. So I think that's a risk. But also the fact that 94% of our food supply is kind of concentrated in 9 major retailers in the UK. So I think those kinds of dimensions to the system also add to its vulnerability.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. My next question, guys, you've already answered to an extent because you all mentioned specific risks and things like that. But I'm going to ask it anyway because I just want to ask you about the real world impacts on food and drink systems right now, and where you think the next risks might be. Major risks might be emerging. So, again, if we could go back to James for that one, if you could summarize that for us.
Of course, thanks, Dave. I think the point I'm going to latch onto this one is about climate change, one of the climate change risk, and the real impact we expect to see that have on those global food systems. So, latching onto what Bobby's mentioned around costs and the challenge we're already seeing play out in the industry. At the IGD, we recently released a climate risk assessment looking at how global climates will change based on three different scenarios of global warming. And then how does that directly translate into cost lines within the UK from an additional cost perspective? And if I take business as usual context, so we don't hit our net zero targets by 2050 as a society, we can see that play out to work to the tune of around £2.6 billion of additional operating costs across the entire UK food system alone. Now, that is quite a significant stat when we think about already the thin margins that operate through the food manufacturing, logistics, and retailing landscape. And when you zoom into product types like dairy, for examples, we can see that is disproportionately impacted by the heat stress on the land, which in turn also impacts productivity that comes out of your animals as well. So you're creating additional costs in areas as well. So I think when you connect all these challenges together to the situation that many organizations and shoppers are facing at the moment is how do we become more sustainable? How do we prepare for these disruptions and also do it in a way that works commercially but works for the societal good as well?
Thanks, James. Rod, does that chime with you in terms of the emerging risks and the real world impacts today?
Yes, I'd agree with that. I think, in a sense, the food industry has been a victim of its own success over the COVID period. The industry came together with government. We managed to cope. There was some shortages on shelves, but we came through it. And so, unfortunately, in a way, I think that potentially has created a bit of a sort of impression that no matter what comes the way of the food industry, we'll be able to weather the storm. I think that's quite a dangerous attitude. I think there need to be contingency plans on the part of business, and I see a lot of hope there in terms of businesses working on contingencies, hedging raw material costs, for example, and energy costs, which in the current climate you really see the virtue of. But I don't quite see yet at government level the kind of cross-departmental coordinated strategy that we need that takes into account all these kind of factors and the impact on the food supply chain. And given the food supply chain is one of the 14 critical infrastructures in UK, there's few things more fundamental than enabling people to eat, then I think that is a degree of complacency that we can't really afford to continue with, really. One additional thing that I would mention that has been mentioned so far is animal disease risk. So we're in a situation now where a number of different scenarios are all hitting simultaneously, and we might be fortunate and we might just be dealing with those scenarios and we'll be able to cope with that. But all it takes is one more scenario to come in there, whether that is a major cybersecurity attack, or whether it's significant animal disease, for example, African swine fever or foot and mouth disease hitting UK farmers. And that may well be the thing that takes us over the line. So that brings me back to the real need for government and industry to come together and take this extremely seriously.
Yeah, those sound like wise words, Rod, if I may say so. Robert, again, same question. What's the real world impacts, and what are the next major risks that are emerging?
Well, yeah, I don't want to encroach on a question a little bit later on involving government, but one of the things we'll all remember, and Rod alluded to it a little bit there, was the food shortage crisis and the lack of drivers in the UK post Brexit that was causing one of the issues for food on shelves. Now, if you look at that, the question I ask is, did we actually solve the problem? No. We created a solution as we did. Unfortunately, the transport industry, and together with industries like the food supply chain, created a solution. So both the suppliers and the customers adapted accordingly, but we didn't solve the core problem. We haven't solved the problem of recruiting drivers in the UK into the sector, which, as we move forward and further into this, will become a problem. The average driver age in the UK is 55 plus. Now, that doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out the timescales we have in order to solve that. And there are no or very little still new recruits coming in. So for me, that is a major issue because we'll still need to deliver the product, until we learn to teletransport product to customers. We're still going to have to do it. And if we haven't got that level of people in, we need to solve that. And I see that, it's all over the world. It's not just, UK based.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you, Robert. Bobby, same question. I mean, obviously, we've had three slightly different answers there, but although all going in the same direction. What about your view on this?
Yeah, I think obviously the issues right now which are affecting, is obviously sort of, your cost volatility, your energy and fuel and labour shortages. That is where the now is being felt. But I do think sort of the next major risks are probably around sort of energy stability and cyber security. And I know we're going to come on to a little bit more on that, so I don't want to talk too much right now. But businesses are becoming more digitized and automated. So any disruption, really, physical or digital, is going to have a much bigger operational impact. So looking ahead, that's where I'd say that the key risks are from what I see day to day.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Amanda, I'm sorry, I've left you till the end again. I must do something about this order. Do you largely agree with what you've heard?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, there's the ongoing conflicts, instability, political instability, climate and weather shocks. So, we've talked about those, which lead to vulnerabilities in supply chains. Also, things in terms of climate change, increases in temperatures and humidity, for example, the problems that creates in stored nuts and grains, things like increased mycotoxins, for example, which find their way into the human food supply chain. And then also the increasing illegal importation, so which leads to higher increased risk of disease and food fraud. So they're sort of emerging challenges or ongoing challenges. And then I think, as has been mentioned, this kind of challenge between businesses trying to adopt digital technologies in order to become more efficient and supply more sustainable, healthier, more affordable food, balancing that off against the increased susceptibility to cyber attacks. So I think that they're sort of some of the emerging challenges and risks that I foresee.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you, all of you. That was some excellent answers there, and it's very interesting how you identified all slightly different things, but they're all obviously serious risks emerging. Moving on, a report published earlier this year warned that the UK is a tinderbox, one major shock away from a potential food crisis, with cyber attacks and system failures identified as key risks. So what new vulnerabilities is digitalization creating for the food and drink supply chain? And how important is investment in cyber resilience? Rod, could I start with you on this one, please?
Sure, Dave. So vitally important, I think, and we've already alluded to it. If you look at the sort of incidents that we've seen in the last year, huge numbers of the SME sector, which makes up the majority probably of food producers, that have been hit by cyber attacks over the last year alone. But in terms of the very high profile ones, obviously most people would be familiar with the Marks and Spencer and the Co-op incidents. Now the Marks and Spencer attack cost Marks and Spencer an estimated £136 million. The Co-op attack cost £206 million in lost sales, and obviously both affected availability on shelf to a certain extent as well. So these are real challenges, but essentially they were quite localized, all right, to a major retailer, but they were still quite localized. If you saw an incident that hit the supply chain on a wider level, through potentially infrastructure, for example, then you could see a greater degree of impact. And there are enough bad actors out there, terrorist organizations, hostile states, etc., that have the vested interest and motivation, if you like, to target the food chain in this way, because it is one way that you could really impact on a society in a particular country. So there is a real need, I think, not just to insure yourself against cyber attack, but to have a plan in place and to realize that we're so digitized now that all operate. I mean, you talk to people that had cyber attacks. One of the real dilemmas you have is, how do you actually communicate with people? Because most people will do Teams calls. They're all linked in, computerized now, and so Teams will go down, email will go down. And unless you have a developed plan in place in advance to say, if this happens, this is who I call, this is how I make contact, then it becomes a lot harder, because people are scrambling around to a certain degree, panicking, trying to kind of work out what's going on initially. And that degree of initial communication is vital. Report to the cybersecurity unit within the government is also a good first line, because they can provide support. But I think having a contingency plan in place, and some businesses and organizations routinely across the year will carry out pilot kind of plans, dummy plans, if you like, for what happens under a cyber attack, so that the key personnel that might be affected will know exactly what to do, in the same way that people have fire drills and so forth. And I think that has to be a vital part of what the supply chain does.
Yeah, that's really interesting. James, is that, from your insight from the Institute of Grocery Distribution, do you agree with that, and the vulnerabilities that and cyber resilience and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think some excellent points there. To start, I probably wouldn't use the phrase tinderbox. I don't think that's the case when I look at the landscape at the moment. But I think between the food system, its operators, manufacturing, retailers, sadly, they know all too well about the impacts of cyber risk, for some of the great point that Rod just mentioned. And actually, in a recent government study, it said that 82% of UK businesses, that's not specific to food, but more generally, have experienced some form of incident of cybersecurity in the last year, whether that's minor all the way through to those major incidents. And that's coming in at around 14.7 billion cost for the UK economy. So I think it is more becoming a new challenge, a new dynamic that is imperative to get right. So while it is a scary statistic, I don't see it being quite so inflammatory. But in terms of those new vulnerabilities, I think the one that stands out as the most striking one is, if we were now talking around technology and the role of how do we have smarter, more resilient, more agile supply chains, you can achieve that through better data connectivity, true inventory visibility, and really connecting different organizations into one digital ecosystem. Now, if we see that as the direction of travel, you are adding multiple new gateways and new risks into a food supply chain. And actually, the smart, intelligent systems which span across the organizations are seldom the ones which are most at risk of being targeted. It's the legacy systems which will run the factory line. It's the legacy systems that run the depot booking in and out systems, or even things like payroll. But we're seeing those lateral movement attacks really be the method of choice in a lot of industries. Now, the positives here is, when we speak to a lot of supply chain leaders from in and around the food sector, without prompting, cybersecurity and general supply chain security is really becoming top of mind. But it does really give you a view as to the challenge ahead. But I am confident that there's the right actions taking place. But the watch out is for those organizations who are not on that journey. There is, significant headwinds for them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Amanda, from your point of view, as experienced industry person and from academia, is there enough investment in cyber resilience?
It's quite interesting because James has said that the cost of cyber attacks has been somewhere in the region of 14 billion. Is that correct, James? Um, whereas the Food and Drink Federation launched their a report around digital adoption for the food and drink industry in November 2024, which suggested that over the next 10 years we could unlock 14 billion in additional GVA through improved digital adoption. So it's really that sort of there's kind of like that challenge, isn't there? That digital adoption can unlock GVA, but then it brings additional risks. And also there's the government funded Made Smarter program to support SMEs to move towards greater digital adoption. And actually that's quite a good uh, framework, if you like, particularly for SMEs who are potentially more vulnerable because they don't have the right infrastructures in place to protect against cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is very much part of the Made Smarter digital roadmaps that are produced for SMEs. So, while there are risks involved in digital adoption, there's also support in place, albeit for SMEs. But also, there are universities like Sheffield Hallam around the UK who have expertise, cutting edge expertise in this area. So greater collaboration and greater incentivization from government funding to collaborate with research organisations is also a pathway to improve protection against cyber attacks. So yeah, quite an interesting decision point, I think, for a lot of business owners, particularly small businesses, around, do I adopt greater digital technologies, but then that makes me more vulnerable. So I think that's a challenge that the sector needs support in addressing.
Yeah, I'm sure we could do a webinar just on that if there's so much to address there. But thank you very much for that, Amanda. I want to move on a little bit. I want to talk a bit more about climate change and its effect as well. Extreme weather and climate volatility are increasingly impacting global food and drink supply chain. And it's affecting everything from production through to the transport of goods. So what role do you think does climate resilience have to play in protecting long-term food supply stability? And what's the cost of failing to act quickly enough? James, can I come to you again on this one?
Of course. I think just latching onto that stat I shared here, I'm a 2.6 billion in a business as usual situation. I think when we look at generally where the food industry is going and the priority and investment that's going in for many huge businesses to get their carbon emissions down, we look more towards what we would call a delayed transition scenario. So we'd still predict that extra 1.4 billion in costs at that lower point to then be in the food system by 2050. However, when we then look at that climate resilience conversation and what we see happen, we see some incredibly interesting things playing into the market. Because if we actually look over to one particular retailer over in Europe, Albert Heijn, they're a Dutch retailer who've really thought about their supply chain in a very unique way. And actually, rather than trying to get multiply diverse strategies or building additional inventory stocks or whichever different strategies we might think about playing right now, what they've done is partnered with the academic world and actually made live trials in greenhousing situations so they can replicate some of the world's most unusual climates. And ginger, which is specifically grown typically in parts of Latin America and parts of China because it needs the right level of humidity, they've been able to replicate that in the Netherlands. Now, when they benchmark themselves against their competition, of course, their costs will be higher. But when we now think about climate resilience and the cost of getting it right, I think we're going to see a lot more of this because we know that as supply chains become more challenged, some will be offset by their technologies, by better planning. Some will be disrupted, but for how long? Bringing more of these things into that circle of influence for me on key lines is something I think is going to be a very different way of thinking, but will start to emerge as really commonplace as we look forward ahead 10, 15 years.
Thanks, James. And Rod, can I get you to address this one as well, please?
Yes, thanks, Dave. Extreme weather is clearly having a quite significant impact on the UK. Recent evidence from the University of Durham, so sort of December last year, survey found that 87% of farmers in the UK had seen lower productivity because of droughts, floods, or heat waves. Similarly, according to the UK government's annual Food Security Digest, 40% of mainland Europe was in drought, Greece, southern Italy, Spain, for example, in June 2025. So that gives you kind of an idea of the existing impact. And of course, these impacts will kind of increase. So I think that there are a number of strategies that you can adopt. Spread betting in terms of, diversifying the supply chain is obviously quite crucial. So you're not reliant overly on, one or two sources of supply where possible. Clearly, technology can play a part, as James said. That can play a part in ramping up domestic production in the UK. Looking at different styles of production that won't be impacted quite as much by floods and by droughts. There are kind of ways of doing that, although they themselves then have implications in terms of energy use. So, how you would draw on energy, renewable energy resource. The Renewable Energy Initiative is a really interesting one at the moment that's kind of looking at, how we can increase renewable energy reliance, and a number of food producers and processors are powering some of their plants to the tune of about 100% renewable energy at the moment, and even selling energy back to the grid. So I think, that wider point around energy then feeds into use of technology, which can enhance kind of domestic production. But there's always going to be an element of food that you will have to source from the wider globe. And then these other areas come into play, like, as I say, spread betting and kind of just making sure you've got a diversified supply chain and backups if, there are problems in one area as much as you can.
Thanks, Rod. Look, obviously, we're talking about all these pressures on supply chains, but I'd love to talk a little bit about solutions as well, being deployed to protect them. And I was wondering, whether volatility is creating a case for a shift in inventory strategy from just in time to just in case, for example, and whether a rethink is needed in where and how products are being sourced. I mean, sorry, Rod, do you mind if I stick with you for this one?
Thank you, Dave. Yes. So there's a very good report, which I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be familiar with by now, from Tim Lang, just in case 7 steps to narrow the UK civil food resilience gap. It's one of the best reports I've certainly read on enhancing supply chain resilience. And Tim makes quite a lot of recommendations. One of the things he does focus on is having the infrastructure in place within the UK market at local level, so that if there are incidents that cause issues with supply, then there are contingency plans in place to be able to distribute food effectively at regional level. He makes a number of recommendations on that side of things, really. So all parts of industry, I think, can come together. They've shown that with COVID. So we can come together and unite and work together. And obviously, IGD itself does a lot of good work in scenario planning and bringing companies together in this area. And I think, they can work with NGOs to solve a lot of problems. I think with food redistribution, we've seen recently an initiative from the government to try to improve the situation where you're looking at particularly food waste and food waste issues. Redistributing that food in an effective manner as well can play a part. And I think also making sure you've got sufficient warehousing resource, so you've got sufficient storage capacity. Looking at infrastructure on that level is also going to be particularly valuable.
And James, could I get you to address that one as well? The case for changing strategies.
Of course. So I think the main shift we'll see is, yes, looking more towards just in case, but I think it'll be more around a dynamic and interchangeable shift. So I think when we look at about what we'd call the supply chain ecosystem, which is where you're connecting all your inventory data points against your labor data points, against your availability, against news, data feeds, and global risk essentially across the supply chain, across each of the parties within it. That sounds incredibly futuristic, but the foundation's already been built in many cases to get us there. Now, when you start to have that end-to-end view, and you then start to identify where risks are emerging, even if they're not fully confirmed, you can detect, okay, I've got risk in this area. That then ability to autonomously move into a just in case strategy, I think is going to be the biggest, most competitive lever. And again, by having those different diversified sourcing strategies, having clear data frameworks that allow organizations to make changes in preset, pre-planned ways, is how we're going to see that shift play out. Because there is still going to be pressure across organizations for fresher products for customers. Food waste is becoming increasingly challenging across the food landscape. It's not something that people like to see, even if the intention behind it was good. So I think where organizations will lean into just in case, it needs to be safe bets that they are doing it to offset risk and doing it in a very quickly digitally enabled way.
Thanks, James. Rob, I wonder if I could just turn to you to sort of develop this theme a bit, because obviously you're there as the managing director of Palletways. You're at the sharp end of a lot of this stuff. So can you shed some light on the importance of adaptable transport solutions in helping businesses respond to supply chain volatility? I mean, you've already mentioned the problem with drivers, and I know one of our audience has put a question on the Q&A about that as well, which you've answered. But anyway, if you could talk about some of the solutions you're putting in place. You need to unmute, Rob.
That's two ticks for mute. Absolutely, yeah. I talk about pallet network sector and the support we give to not just the food chain, manufacturing in that just in time and indeed just in case scenario. Our model is effectively a 24-hour contract. You give us a product today, we deliver it anywhere in Western Eastern Europe tomorrow. In respective country and trunk times allowing, which is an adaptable, a truly adaptable solution that we can provide. But just flip that the other way, and you talked earlier about fertilizers for farmers and raw material products. If you think the other way, where some growers and manufacturers can't either afford to buy the bulk for their raw materials, we provide a solution the other way where we could deliver minimum quantities to them daily, or hold stock for them and deliver it to them next day in the whole traditional consignment stock model. But we do it, or the sector can do it very, very palletized quantities, small palletized quantities. So that adaptable solution is there. But what a lot of people miss is it's not an instead of scenario. It can be used as an as well of scenario. So it's like having a tool in your armory to have that, excuse me, that adaptability to be able to do both. You don't have just to move to that as one solution. It's a part of your overall solution. So I think that visibility from people running those supply chains is something that can go onward and upward. In a lot of the manufacturing industries, we're beginning to see more and more of that. Particularly in the automotive sector, for instance, where there's lots of similarities with supply, etc. So I think it's having that vision to have an adaptable solution as well as an overall supply and delivery solution.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about automation and AI now. So what role are automation and artificial intelligence playing in improving supply chain resilience, and how are you seeing them being deployed in practice today? Amanda, would you mind if we started with you on this one?
Yeah, no, that's fine. And sort of from our perspective, the sort of discussions we have with businesses are around the predictive side of AI, and how that can help with supply chain modeling. Um, so I think that there's a real opportunity, if you like, to kind of to automate, if you like, those traditional um, processes of forecasting and linking the entire end-to-end supply chain through AI. Predictive modeling. I think the problem is, and not wanting to go back to the digital adoption is low in most of the supply chain, and there's a much greater opportunity for the sector, but I think they need that confidence and the support to be able to do that. So I think there is an opportunity, but I think I think there's about an 8% uptake in free government support from food and drink manufacturers to do this stuff. And it's the largest manufacturing sector in the UK. So that's a bit of an indication of the kind of challenge we've got. So while there are opportunities, I also think there's a piece of work we need to do to really support the sector to adopt those. Obviously, there are the sort of large global and national businesses who are further along this journey. But as Rod said before, 98% of the sector are SMEs. So that's where the challenge lies and where the opportunity lies as well.
Thanks, Amanda. And Bobby, can I get you to address this one? AI, artificial intelligence, automation.
Yeah, just obviously following on from Amanda's points, automation and AI, from our perspective now, they're playing a fundamental role, sort of in that strengthening of the resilience within, your food and drink supply chains, especially sort of if you consider the sector faces challenges around short shelf life, fluctuating demand, labour shortages, and the cost pressures that come along with it. And importantly, that there is no longer something on the horizon anymore. Like automate isn't in the future; it's sort of here now, and it's being deployed at scale. And just a few of those benefits that come along with that. Going back to what Amanda said, is sort of the cost control and optimization, which will obviously help manage rising energy, the labour, operational costs more effectively. It helps with improved accuracy and reduced errors, which sort of minimizes picking errors, stock discrepancies, and the handling of the damage throughout the supply chain. And then obviously with that, you get an increased efficiency and throughput where your systems operate consistently, improving productivity, especially in high volume environments. So you can see why the food sector particularly does want to move that way. Hopefully there can be a bit more support, like Amanda says, to get us there, because it certainly is like the now. It's not the future. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. And James, could I get you to address this one as well? You're still muted, James.
There we go. That's one strike for me. So from an AI perspective, I always look at this as a bit of a sliding scale, because at its most extreme, all developed, all singing, all dancing, you have this digital ecosystem making digital decisions like I spoke about in the previous section. But then actually, when we look at real change curves for organizations, and we made a great point just there around actually, digital adoption and people actually getting on the journey with AI. It has more advisory roles. How in our sector, when you take the massive data collected at logistics stages, at manufacturing stages, agricultural and retailer, that is an absolute wealth of data that's always not in the best of quality as well. So it's easily to create a situation where you can be stunned and overloaded rather than actually filtering that into actions. So I think the first phase we'll see is the role of AI emerging to reduce the manual workload, build to big, large scale data sets into really critical actions on, okay, there's a risk here. You need to have a conversation with this organization and confirm it's in a good place. Actually, this is your service report from yesterday. These are your biggest failures to address now. Things which won't feel too different from some of the things that are going on today. And I think as organizations go on that journey, it will gradually move more towards that more automated, more autonomy, better control. Just nodding to one of the questions as well in the chat, and what I found really interesting when talking around the topic of AI and automation, we grouped a group of 30 plus supply chain leaders back in March, and we talked to them for a number of different topics, one of them being AI. And one of the number one pain points that came back and areas that we need to look at moving forward is actually not the technology itself, but do the people entering the workforce now have the right, education, training, exposure to AI? And actually, is the technology moving faster than our core skill sets are? So again, another different consideration. And then lastly, just before I leave this point, I think when we talk about those solutions and how they're being deployed in practice today, there's a lot, everyone wants to jump and talk about the sexy topic, which is the AI, the automation, and the benefits. But I think what we're seeing actually being deployed in practice today is long and slow roads of getting the data foundations correct, improving the integrity, improving the input, and then also refining the base processes so that they are scalable. And once organizations do that, we see a much better return on investment and feedback from organizations that then go on to land their AI journey.
Thank you, James. Rising fuel and energy costs are obviously an issue which we've touched upon, and arguably they're very significant because obviously we all need fuel, we all need to power our businesses. So I wonder, does electrification offer an opportunity for organizations to cushion themselves against those pressures, notwithstanding the fact that obviously electricity has to be got from somewhere and has to be produced somehow? But how is it all, is it already being deployed, and is it is it an important part of this picture? Amanda?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So we've been doing a piece of work at Sheffield Hallam University with food and drink businesses, looking at their energy mix, and the businesses we audited, 77% of their energy utilization was gas. Now, I think the latest sort of national reports from 2023 suggest about 58% of that energy utilization is gas. But the businesses we audited, it was much higher. So there's a real opportunity there to reduce reliance on gas. I'm talking about food manufacturing as opposed to the sort of the transportation side. And as you say, what we've also looked at as part of those case studies was looking at the electricity supply and the mix of sources of energy going into that electricity supply, because I think that's really important to look at. So really going back to source. If you layer on top of that some of the work that is being done in universities around looking at alternative heating and cooling solutions, so particularly in heating, gas is a major source of energy, and looking at how you can use alternative electrification, which reduces energy utilization by up to 90%. But again, these are proof of concept technologies, and businesses need that support in retrofitting and scaling up, because that's where the real cost is. So the technology is out there are opportunities, and again, it's just about how we support a kind of low margin sector to adopt those. So I think, yes, there are opportunities to reduce energy utilization, but I don't think they're straightforward.
No, quite. And Bobby, can I get you to address this one as well, please, the electrification issue?
Yeah, sure. And obviously my perspective looking into this is probably going back to the sort of products that we offer as a business to the sector. So I think, going all electrification, it offers a real cushion against the rise in fuel and energy costs. But it's not just about cost, really. It's about control and efficiency. Um, in practice, we're seeing a widespread adoption of electric equipment, sort of mainly in warehousing and food environments, against sort of the internal combustion engines. Electric fleets are more energy efficient. They generally require less maintenance, and they allow businesses to manage and predict their energy usage a little bit easier. And I think helpful with that is a big shift towards smart charging and energy management systems. Businesses can charge fleets during off-peak periods and optimize overall consumption in temperature controlled environments where energy usage is already high. So that kind of control becomes even more valuable. I think that's the real piece around electrification. It's about control and it being, efficient. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Bobby. Would anybody else like to talk about the electrification issue before I move on? Robert?
Yeah, I'll come in. Yeah, obviously, again, talking purely from a final or first mile perspective, and little bit encroaching on what Bobby was saying. Battery power to support that, whilst it's been there, it's not efficient enough at all at the moment to work fully. In that supply chain, the lighter vehicles that are delivering in and around towns and cities you can use, although they do cost you more money because of the recharge, the recharge time. But certainly for distance vehicles, we haven't got the infrastructure to charge them, in order to keep them efficient for how much they cost. And it's the same with forklifts. And Bobby will say, we have a 24/7 requirement for our forklifts to work, and somewhere in there, if there's a fast charge, and there will be, I guess, in time, but not yet, it's not quite there yet. So whilst in some circumstances, yes, in the pure road transport industry, for me it's more of a gimmick solution rather than a solution just yet, but that's sort of where it is now.
Okay, so the technology's still got a little way to go to
Absolutely
catch up. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that. Thanks very much, Robert. I'm hoping we're gonna have time to answer a few of the questions that have come up. But before we do, I wanted to ask the panel a final question. If you had to prioritize one key area of investment for food and drink businesses right now to build resilience, both in the short and long term, what would it be? So let's go back to our original order. Let's start with James on this one, please.
Brilliant. I'm going to cheat here and give two, but be very, very quick in how I do it. I think we've spoke about two very different topics there. So we think to start with on cybersecurity, I think we've already heard from Rod, who had some great examples of organizations who are stress testing their internal capability. I think if organizations are not doing that and looking at how they move continuity planning from the static backup plan that we get out if it goes wrong to that evolving live tested process, now is absolutely the time to be doing that. And also making sure that the highest standard that you work to is then aligned to across your hauliers, across your planners, across your suppliers and your customers. So you are all working to the same integrity. I think as well, when we talk about technology, lots of rewards in terms of resilience, planning, efficiency gains internally. But unfortunately, the journey to get there does need those building blocks set up of good data practices, strong quality of the data, and the auditing and the management of that data to be set up in the right way. So do think about what are the processes, are they in the state where you'd want them to be, and also how does your data flow underneath that, and building the data roadmap before you get to the stage of I want to develop AI, I want to connect everything autonomously. Those would be my two big actions for today.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Rod, could I turn to you for this one, please?
Yes, thanks. So from my point of view, I think clearly ring fencing reliable and cost-effective energy supply will continue to be a major issue for the food industry going forwards. So I think, the renewable energy offers a considerable solution there, and all the disruption we're seeing right now brings that home all the more, really, and that's just purely a strong business case. I do also think there's a considerable case for looking at stockpiling and storage of product, so that you have product in reserve. You can do that, and there's a way of doing that. Clearly, obviously, if you're in the short shelf life supply chain game, that presents more challenges. But I think on the level of the whole supply chain across the UK, that's an area that would reward more kind of focus, I think. So yeah, that would be my thoughts.
Right. Thanks, Rod. Robert, could I turn to you, as at the sharp end again on your pallet delivery? What's the one thing that you would prioritise?
I think right now the government need to act. We've talked a lot today about SMEs. The SMEs in the transport sector, their fuel cost has risen exponentially, as has the government's revenues from increased VAT and taxation system. So why aren't we reinvesting that back into the transport sector? Because these smaller SMEs, what they've seen is their fuel costs go up, their credit limits have not changed, so they're having to pay for their fuel far more often than they did previously. And in some instances, they can't operate, and we'll see these businesses collapse because of cash. The government need to act now to get that back into the sector. So that would be my one wish right now.
Okay, thanks, Robert. And Bobby, could I get you to address this one?
Yeah, again, sort of seeing into the conversations I'm having day to day, weekly with people, prioritizing one area. Generally, I do think it's automation. I think in the short term, it helps businesses manage their labour shortages. It improves their efficiency and it helps maintain consistency. But in a longer term, it's about building a more resilient, scalable operation that can adapt to demand of the shifts and ongoing disruption. Automation gives businesses control over cost. It gives them consistent performance and reliability. And I think from hearing what everybody has said, that's exactly what the sector needs right now. But touching on James' points originally, the importance of having that data and everything in place beforehand, it's very vital. But I'm sure that suppliers can help along the way with that, working together in partnership approaches.
Thanks, Bobby. And Amanda, what's your sort of feeling about prioritising one key area?
So I'm going to cheat as well and say two. So if I had a magic wand, I would see a government that valued the food system and prioritised it. I think it's an ongoing challenge and has been for years. So that would be one area. And then the other area, in terms of what businesses can invest in, I would say invest in time to look beyond the day to day and start looking at open innovation and ways in which you can improve your business. Because when you start doing that, you start seeing the real growth of your business.
Okay, that's the classic working on the business rather than in the business. Yes, thank you very much, Amanda. So listen, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I want to just raise one or two of these questions that have come up on the Q&A from our audience, and some interesting stuff here. We've got a question from Patrick Griffin. He wants to know how a logistics company is addressing theft, especially where cyber resilience is impacting at truck level with jamming of cellular and spoofing GPS, as seen frequently now to the east side of Europe. I hope I've read that correctly. Theft, I suppose, James, do your sort of, in your experience, is that a major problem in terms of the resilience picture?
I think it's a significant problem, and look, we see on a much grander scales, it's almost a similar technology to what you see with aircraft signals being jammed over hostile airspaces. It's a very sort of similar, more extreme version of that. I think the challenge is balancing the return on investment for the kind of technologies you need to protect against that versus what is lost per load per occurrence. So it's not an area I'm particularly close to. I think there are some very complex and some big technologies that would help with that. It's how you make that build into the commerciality of a model, and actually how do you make it deliver the return on investment?
Yeah.
It's the challenge.
Okay. Rob, I've got a question specifically for you here that has been put up. As someone moving goods from A to B, do you think transport businesses get an early sense of when disruption could be coming down the supply chain?
I think we do. I think we do, and it's about that feedback. I think the way that we feed that back in. We are often the early warning indicator. We certainly use our driver intelligence right at the very front end when the drivers are out there for whatever's going on. And that comes back in, and it's far more powerful than us, delving into data. If I'm bluntly honest, at that front end, and I think we certainly feed it back to a lot of our customers if anything comes along. But I think that across that chain, the information that we could, or the further information that we could share in both sides of the scale could be invaluable. So I do agree with that. And on the cyber stuff that we just talked about, sorry, the previous question, from my point of view, yeah, we have, as James said, the cost and the scalability of it. It's when you drill down into the SMEs, whether they're in Europe, Eastern Europe, or across the world, those smaller SMEs haven't got the financial infrastructure. We have bots looking at the bots, chasing the bots, if you know what I mean, every day. The smaller companies don't have that, and I think it's how we resolve that globally, not just in the UK.
Thank you very much, Robert. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but thank you so much for joining the webinar this morning, and we hope you found it useful and interesting. Thanks to our expert panel, James Rothwell, Rod Addy, Robert Gittins, Bobby Campbell, and Amanda Johnston, for sharing their insights over the past hour. A recording of this webinar and a special report containing all the key discussion points from today's session will be available via the Linde Material Handling website. That's at www.linde-mh.co.uk, and look for the Intralogistics Live page. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.